Religion has often been described as a force for unity, a moral compass, or even the foundation of civilizations. But when we step back and look at history with an honest lens, we see a very different story. Religion has repeatedly served as a spark, a justification, and a weapon in some of humanity's bloodiest conflicts. And the irony is striking. The same institutions that preach peace, compassion, and love have often been at the heart of division, hatred, and war. When we look at global conflicts, religion doesn't always appear as the sole cause. Wars are usually complex, with roots in politics, economics, and power struggles. But religion consistently magnifies tensions. It turns disputes into existential battles. It paints opponents not just as rivals, but as heretics, infidels, or enemies of the divine. And when people believe they are fighting for their God, compromise becomes almost impossible. You can negotiate over land or resources, but how do you negotiate with someone who claims to be carrying out a divine mission? Consider the Crusades, often romanticized in some parts of culture as noble quests. In reality, they were campaigns of conquest and brutality. Tens of thousands were killed, not just soldiers, but civilians, all under banners marked with crosses. Religion provided the justification for invading foreign lands, seizing wealth, and massacring those who didn't submit. And yet, behind the sermons of holy war, kings and popes had very earthly motives: power, influence, and control of trade routes. Religion was the marketing campaign that sold slaughter as salvation. The same pattern played out during the 30 Years' War in Europe. What began as a dispute between Protestant and Catholic rulers escalated into one of the deadliest conflicts in European history. Entire regions were devastated, economies collapsed, and millions died, all in the name of religious truth. Yet, as the decades dragged on, the war became less about theology and more about politics and territory. Religion was the banner that legitimized endless bloodshed, while leaders maneuvered for dominance. This is the first critical observation. Religion doesn't just inspire conflict directly, it sanctifies it. It makes violence righteous. It takes ordinary human greed and ambition and clothes it in divine authority. That's why rulers throughout history have leaned on priests, clerics, and imams to bless their wars. A soldier will fight harder when he believes he's fighting for eternity, not just for a king's treasury. But it's not only history books that tell this story. In the modern world, religion still fuels conflicts across the globe. The Israeli-Palestinian conflict, for example, is often framed in terms of land, sovereignty, and security. But at its core lies a religious narrative, two peoples claiming divine right to the same sacred ground. What might otherwise be a political negotiation becomes a holy struggle, resistant to compromise, because sacred land is not something you can trade or share. Similarly, sectarian violence in places like Iraq, Syria, and Yemen is deeply tied to religious identity. Sunni and Shia groups have fought each other for centuries, not just over theology, but over who holds the authority to interpret divine will. That division has left scars that continue to destabilize entire regions. Politicians may exploit these divisions for power, but the deep emotional pull comes from religion itself, which convinces people that the other side is not just politically misguided, but spiritually illegitimate. And in South Asia, the partition of India in 1947 stands as one of the starkest examples of how religion can divide populations that had coexisted for generations. The creation of India and Pakistan was driven by the idea that Hindus and Muslims could not live together peacefully. The result? One of the largest forced migrations in human history, with up to 15 million people displaced and up to 1 million killed. Families were torn apart, and the seeds of hostility planted during that division still haunt the region today. Religion's influence on conflict is not just about violence between large groups. It also shapes terrorism and insurgency. Groups like Al-Qaeda, ISIS, and Boko Haram use religious texts and interpretations as recruitment tools. They convince young people that blowing themselves up or killing civilians is a path to eternal reward. Without religion, these groups would struggle to justify the level of sacrifice they demand from their followers. Political grievances alone rarely convince someone to strap on a suicide vest. religion adds the layer of transcendence, turning political violence into cosmic duty. Even in conflicts that seem primarily ethnic or cultural, religion is often present as an invisible hand. In the Balkans during the 1990s, Orthodox Christians, Catholics, and Muslims became markers of identity that determined life or death. Entire villages were destroyed, not because of individuals' actions, but because of the faith associated with their community. Here again, religion didn't cause the war outright, but it sharpened the lines of division, making coexistence impossible in the eyes of extremists. And the cost of these conflicts is staggering. A study by the Pew Research Center found that more than 40% of the world's countries experience high or very high levels of religious hostilities. These hostilities range from government restrictions on minority faiths to violent clashes and terrorism. Religion is not a minor factor. It is one of the most consistent predictors of conflict around the globe. One of the most overlooked aspects of religion's role in conflict is how it reshapes identity. Religion doesn't just tell people what rituals to follow or what food to avoid. It builds entire frameworks of belonging. When someone is told from birth that they are part of a chosen people, or that their group holds the one true path, that belief becomes inseparable from their sense of self. So, when conflict arises, it's not just about territory or resources. It feels like an attack on one's very existence, because faith and identity are fused together. This fusion of religion and identity creates a kind of psychological armor, making compromise or reconciliation feel like betrayal. In Northern Ireland, for example, the conflict between Catholics and Protestants was as much about identity as it was about political representation. Religion became the symbol of which side you belonged to. Entire neighborhoods were divided, schools were segregated, and people were judged on their names or accents. The theological differences between Catholics and Protestants were relatively minor compared to the broader struggle for rights and power. But religion amplified those divisions, making them rigid and deeply personal. Another way religion fuels conflict is through the language it provides. Religious texts are filled with imagery of battles between good and evil, the righteous and the damned. Leaders exploit this language to rally followers. By framing opponents as the embodiment of evil or as enemies of God, any act of violence against them becomes not just acceptable, but virtuous. It is no coincidence that many militias, insurgents, and even governments use religious rhetoric in their propaganda. They know that faith has a unique ability to override doubt, reason, and even fear of death. And this is not just a problem of the distant past or remote regions. Even in highly developed societies, religion continues to influence foreign policy and military decisions. In the United States, religious lobbying groups have played a significant role in shaping policy in the Middle East, particularly regarding Israel. The idea that certain land is divinely promised influences billions of dollars in aid and military support, which in turn perpetuates conflict in that region. When policies are tied to scripture rather than pragmatic interests, they become resistant to change, no matter the human cost. It's important to recognize another subtle point. Religion often masks itself as the victim in conflicts it helps perpetuate. Leaders will claim that their faith is under attack, that their way of life is threatened, or that their God is being disrespected. This narrative of persecution is extremely powerful. It mobilizes entire populations and justifies preemptive strikes, even when no real threat exists. History is filled with wars launched under the claim of defending the faith, when in reality, they were about expanding territory or consolidating power. Take the Ottoman-Safavid Wars between the Sunni Ottoman Empire and the Shia Safavid Empire. Both sides invoked the defense of their true faith as the justification for brutal wars. In truth, they were empires competing for dominance over trade routes and territories. But by cloaking the conflict in religion, leaders ensured that ordinary people fought with zeal, convinced that their eternal souls were at stake. Religious conflict also thrives on exclusivity. Most religions, at their core, claim to hold the ultimate truth. This makes them inherently competitive. If one faith is right, the others must be wrong. This zero-sum thinking is fertile ground for hostility. In politics or economics, compromise is possible. Two parties can share resources or strike deals. But when the dispute is about divine truth, compromise becomes heresy. A religious leader cannot easily admit that another faith might be equally valid without undermining their own authority. This rigidity ensures that even small disagreements can escalate into deep and violent divides. Even when religions preach tolerance, the tolerance is often conditional. It usually extends only as far as the religion's dominance remains unchallenged. Minority groups are accepted as long as they don't seek equal power. The moment they do, tolerance erodes and repression begins. This has been seen repeatedly in countries where dominant faith